Okay, so you have three planes. You have your sagittal plane, frontal plane, and transverse plane. In your sagittal plane, which is here, it divides the left and right half of your body into two. In that plane in particular, you can do flexion and extension of your elbows. So this is flexion, this is extension. You also have your transverse plane, which is here. It divides the top and bottom half of your body, which is your superior and inferior parts of your body. So you can do have rotation of your torso there. And then you can also have your frontal plane, which is the front and back half of your body, which is your anterior, which is the front side, and your posterior, which is your back side. And we can do abduction of your arms, well, of your shoulder, and adduction of your shoulders. Moving on to anatomical directions. Anatomical directions are used to describe something in relation to something else, to describe how close or further something is to each other. So you have superior, inferior, cranial, and caudal. Superior and cranial are more related toward the top of your body. Inferior and caudal are more like toward the bottom of your body. You also have proximal and distal. Proximal describes how close something is in relation to something else. Distal also describes how further something is in relation to something else. You also have posterior and anterior. Posterior describes more towards the back of your body. Anterior describes more towards the front portion of your body. You also have superficial and deep. Superficial describes something that is more towards like the surface of your body. Deep is going to describe something that is more like underneath that superficial layer. So for example, like if you have skin is more superficial. Your tissues, blood vessels, everything is more deeper underneath your skin, if that makes sense. Okay, so then you want to move on into the movements of the body. We have flexion, extension, and hyperextension. We're going to kind of start there. So for flexion, we have flexion of the elbows and extension of the elbows. Hyperextension can usually be described as something that like go past that normal range of motion. I don't have hyperextended knees, but typically the normal person stands up straight. Someone with hyperextended knees can exceed that, typical range of motion, and that is what hyperextension is. Then we can move on into abduction and adduction. Abduction is going to make something go away from that midline, if that makes sense. So we have abduction of your shoulders. And to help kind of remember that, abduction, ABD, the B and the D faces away from each other. So like going away. Adduction, we're going to add things together and we're going to bring that back toward our body. And that is adduction of your shoulder. Okay, so then we're going to move on into internal and external rotation. These particular movements occur at the joints of the shoulder and the hip. To describe internal and external rotation, it is simply internal rotation of the shoulder, external rotation of the shoulder. It's just that simple. Moving on into circumduction. Circumduction happens at your hip and your shoulders. Circumduction in your shoulders looks like this. And it can happen in your hip, but it won't be as smooth as it is in your shoulder, only because the bones that we have down here in this pelvic area is kind of like irregular. So it won't be as smooth, but it's smooth enough. And that is where circumduction occurs. Now I move on into horizontal abduction and adduction. That simply looks like this. Horizontal abduction because we're going away. Horizontal adduction because we're going closer to that midline. Okay, now I'm going to be demonstrating to you lateral flexion, elevation, depression, supination, and pronation. Lateral flexion looks like this. Like I said, lateral is more towards that outside, not towards the middle, but more towards the outside. So that looks like this. We have supination and pronation. Supination is palms up. Pronation is palms down. So supination, we have supinated curls. We have pronated curls. Sounds familiar, I know. And we also have elevation and depression. Elevation is this. Depression is this. And that is elevation and depression of your scapula. We also have elevation and depression also in your rib cage. When you inhale and when you exhale. Inhaling is elevation because your lungs expand, and then when you exhale, your lungs depress. Okay, now I'm going to be demonstrating to you eversion, inversion, and also plantar flexion and dorsiflexion. I can't quite have my foot in frame at the moment, but I can also use my hands because they're similar structures. So here, ankle, here, foot. Okay, so we have inversion. That's going to be pointing your toes inward towards the center of your body, that midline. And then you also have eversion, pointing towards like the lateral sides, so outside of your body. And then you also have plantar flexion and dorsiflexion. Dorsiflexion will be pointing your toes upward, and dorsiflexion will be pointing your toes downward. Okay, so now I'm going to be describing to you protraction, retraction, deviation, and opposition. Opposition only happens at your thumb, and that allows for it to like cross over like that. Okay. We also have protraction and retraction that can occur at your mandibular joint. I'm not that quite skilled to do that, but protraction will make it come out, retraction will make it come in, if that makes sense. So like, okay. Deviation simply means to like bring something off its normal track, of course. So your jaw is typically like designed to open and close typically, but you can also move that left and right. So now describing body laying positions to you. I'm not laying down at the moment and I can't quite get that in frame, but I can definitely describe that to you. So if you're laying supine, you're laying flat on the surface and you're laying face up toward the ceiling. Flat on the surface, face up toward the ceiling. If you're laying supine, you're laying back toward the ceiling. So supine, if imagine a flat surface behind me, I'm facing the ceiling. If this is the surface behind me, I'm laying face toward the ceiling. If I'm laying prone, I'm going to be the opposite way, so my back is going to be toward the ceiling. So this is the surface now, the flat surface now, and my back is toward the ceiling. If I'm laying on the side lying, I'm going to be lying on either side of my body. So if this is the surface, I'm lying on the side, okay? This is the surface, I'm lying on the side. Hook lying simply means lying with your knees pointed toward the ceiling, if that makes sense, okay? Okay, so now moving on into your joints, we have your ball and socket joint, and that is typically at your shoulder. The matches perfectly, the bones match up perfectly, the shape, and it's just like, it rotates in there like smooth, ball and socket, like a plug, you know? Okay, moving on into your ellipsoid joint. Your ellipsoid joint is kind of similar to that ball and socket, but not quite necessarily, because it kind of limits that range of motion. So you won't quite have that full circumduction that you would in your shoulder. Your ellipsoid joint is typically found in your wrists and in your ankles, and it allows for flexion and extension. You also can do this inversion and eversion of your foot, your ankle. Then you have your hinge joint. Your hinge joint only allows for movements like flexion and extension, and it's similar to like a door hinge. So flexion and extension can happen in your elbow, it can happen at your knee. So flexion, extension. Okay, so then you have your saddle joint. Your saddle joint is typically found in your thumb, and it allows for movements like opposition to occur. Then we're going to move on to muscle types. You have your flat muscles, which are found in like your abdominal muscles, such as like your obliques, external abdominals, and etc. Then you also have your strap muscles. Your strap muscles are found like, typically you have one like in your leg that crosses over, and it is called your sartorius muscle. Then you have your fusiform muscle and your radiate muscles. Your fusiform muscle, for example, is your biceps brachii, and your radiate muscle, for example, is your trapezius, your traps. Then you have your sphincter muscle. You have an anal sphincter. And all of those listed are parallel muscles, and they run parallel along to the sides of that muscle. And then you have your pinnate muscles, bipinnate, multipinnate, and unipinnate. In unipinnate muscles, your muscle fibers run from a central tendon from one side of that tendon. Meanwhile, a bipinnate runs on both sides of that tendon. In your multipinnate, you have muscle tendons in between those muscles. You have three types of muscle contraction, which are isokinetic, isometric, and isotonic. Isokinetic contractions are at a fixed speed at a particular range of motion, and there's a specific machine designed particularly for that. Then you have your isometric, typically no movement, static movement, pushing against a wall, pushing against a boulder. Those are your isometric contractions. And then you have your isotonic movements, which is dynamic movement, which is your concentric and eccentric movements. Your concentric is like shortening of the muscle. So if you do like a bicep curl, this would be the concentric part of the lift, and releasing slow back down, that would be the eccentric part of the lift. Moving on into your cranial nerves, you can focus on the first three. Olfactory, which is the sense of smell, sensory nerve, being able just to smell just about anything and being able to describe what that smell like. And then you can focus on your optic nerve, which is the sight of seeing. That is also a sensory nerve, just being able to see what is right in front of that person. You can test that out. Then you have your ocular motor nerve, which is your third nerve, and that is a motor nerve that allows for you to move like your eyelid, closing them, blinking them, or whatever the case may be. Okay, and then you have your fourth and fifth, which is your trochlear and your trigeminal nerve. Okay, your trochlear allows for you to look down and in towards the center of your nose, and that is a motor nerve. Okay, and then you have your trigeminal nerve, which is also a sensory and motor nerve, and that just allows for you to have somatic sensation throughout your face. Looking at your sixth and seventh, which is your abducens and your facial nerves. Your abducens is a motor nerve that allows for lateral eye movements, looking toward the left and the right. Okay, and your facial nerves just allows for facial expression. That is a sensory and a motor nerve also. Then you have your 8th cranial nerve, which is a vestibular cochlear nerve, and that is a sensory nerve that allows for balance, and that is an auditory nerve, so it lets you hear and focus on balance. Then you have your 9th cranial nerve, which is your glossopharyngeal nerve, and that is a sensory and motor nerve that allows for taste and sensation on the posterior part of your tongue. Focusing on your 10th cranial nerve, which is your vagus nerve, which is a sensory and motor nerve that allows for autonomic functions to happen in your gut, in your throat, and in your heart. Last but not least, you have your 11th and 12th cranial nerve. Your 11th cranial nerve is your spinal accessory nerve, and that allows for movements in your neck and in your shoulders. That is a motor nerve, okay? And your 12th and last nerve is your hypoglossal nerve. That is movements of the tongue, and that is also a motor nerve, okay? Being able to move your tongue however you want is how you can test out if your hypoglossal nerve is working.